Welcome back to Art of Citizenry and part 2 of Criminalization of Immigration, our mini-series on the human cost of the U.S. immigration system. In our last episode, we dissected the financial and political incentives driving mass detention, how corporations profit from incarceration, and why systemic inefficiencies are deliberately maintained to serve those interests. We unpack the cultural and financial, but mostly financial, incentives for mass incarceration and delayed processing of such migration cases. If a law enforcement agency can detain someone who has not committed a crime, but perhaps just has a different status for an indeterminate amount of time with no guarantee of due process, then who's to say that formula can't be copied and pasted onto the next group of folks that the sitting president decides to villainize? In this episode, we shift our focus to the organizers working tirelessly to push back against these injustices, and the importance of community-led storytelling that centers those directly impacted as leaders of change. The conversation around immigration policy often feels abstract. Debates are about legality, numbers, and enforcement statistics. But while ICE catalogs each of these people as a case number within their, quote, non-detained docket, each immigrant, regardless of status, is a person, someone who has left behind everything familiar in a pursuit of safety, dignity, and opportunity. Yet, rather than being met with a fair chance, the government has launched a massive anti-immigration task force and campaign. Now many, approximately 40,000 at the time of this recording, have found themselves trapped in a purgatory of bureaucratic neglect, detained in unsafe conditions where they're denied basic human rights. We're joined by frontline activists Maru Mora-Villalpando of La Resistencia and international human rights lawyer Alejandra Gonza of Global Rights Advocacy, who both work directly with detained migrants. They will share not just the realities of the detention centers, but the ways they intervene, offering support to those caught in the system. They'll also discuss the obstacles of grassroots organizing, working within systems of limited accountability, and the importance of centering the voices of those most impacted by the detention system. This is not just about policy, it's about people. It's about understanding the weight of forced separation, indefinite detention, and systemic dehumanization. And most importantly, it's about what we can do to fight back against a system that thrives on suffering. Grassroots movements have become a powerful resource for organizing. Maru is the founder of La Resistencia, a local grassroots organization based in Washington working to shut down the Northwest Detention Center.
La Resistencia is a grassroots undocumented-led group in Tacoma, Washington, fighting to end all deportations and all detentions in the state by shutting down the regional detention center located there in Tacoma, Washington. And I'm the founder of the group. I'm no longer in leadership, but I'm still their advisor. The work right now is being led by mainly Latina women that have experienced the system themselves, and it's also led by people that have gone through the system, either being detained or deported themselves. And so my role right now is just to make sure that they are provided the space and resources needed so they can continue their work.
Grassroots movements play a crucial role in the fight for justice by amplifying the voices of directly impacted communities and challenging unjust policies and systems through collective action. These movements mobilize local resources while holding governments and private actors accountable. By centering lived experiences and nurturing solidarity, grassroots organizations create sustained pressure, ensuring that immigrant rights remain a priority in public discourse and legislative agendas.
The work is vast because there's no one easy way to have a solution to this nightmare, such as structural manufactured crisis for immigrants and people of color in general, that it takes a lot of effort to undo all the harm done. And so the work in itself is divided in several areas. So the main area is to be in touch with people in detention daily, throughout the day. So La Resistencia has 3 phone lines to which people in detention can call and report what's going on. They help decide what the strategy should be taken on outside. Many times people in detention take their own strategies and they're organizing by launching hunger strikes or doing some sort of actions in the inside. There's a lot of campaigns, individual campaigns. A lot of people want to take their own campaign public because they have lost their cases. And we know immigration law is very complicated, it's extremely difficult, and it's made for people to lose, right? And so the work in regards to working directly with people detained, it's both working and supporting their organizing inside, to supporting hunger strikes, to supporting their actions, making public all the horrendous things that happen inside, all the conditions. And at the same time, it's taking on public campaigns, which they call the Freedom All campaigns, which are meant to be focused on one person, but the angle of the campaign is to free everybody. So that's one way the work is done. Another way is through direct action by La Resistencia and a lot of ally organizations. They go outside the detention center as often as possible. They do events, protests, demonstrations, anything that can be done. There's something that is called Solidarity Days, which at least once a month is done. And, we bring people to the detention center facility. And there's video calls being done and paid for, by La Resistencia. So people in detention can see through the video calls what's going on outside, that people are definitely outside. People are rallying and they care and they're doing everything they can to support the Resistencia work to shut down the detention center. And then there's another bucket of work that is a lot of policy. So it could be at local level with the city of Tacoma, making them accountable to the fact that the detention center is in their city. At state level as well, they have passed a lot of state legislation to bring accountability to the detention center itself, such as, having inspections. And they have also worked at federal level trying to, bring accountability to the federal congressional delegation, which hasn't really worked very well, but they keep trying. And the last one is at an international level, which is to involve the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights to intervene in behalf of those detained. So as you can see, it's a little bit of everything at every level and every angle available. And what I can say that I've learned a lot about, migrant justice, it takes a lot. It's a lot of effort. And it's not fair that those that are supposed to lead the fight are not allowed to lead the fight because they probably didn't graduate from school. They're not bilingual in English or trilingual, and that the resources are not provided to these kind of groups. It goes to big groups, that know how to write grants. And so not only they have the burden of leading, they have the burden of leading in a very precarious way, even within the migrant justice movement.
Grassroots organizers face significant challenges, including limited funding and resources. Additionally, it's not uncommon for activists to face political and legal barriers such as surveillance or criminalization to suppress dissent. Despite these challenges, grassroots movements remain essential for driving systemic change and holding institutions accountable.
I've done organizing for many, many years. I think that was kind of my path, even since before becoming myself an immigrant, leaving my own country, being forced to leave my own country. And so having the experience of being forced to migrate, having the experience of becoming undocumented, having the experience of becoming, part of the community that has been criminalized just because we exist, is what pushed me to organize with my community as undocumented when I was undocumented for 25 years. And so that led to my need to connect with my own community and organize with my own community, which sounds easy, but it's not, because a community being criminalized is a community that is being surrounded by fear, by poverty, by stigma. And so there's so many challenges that those communities have to face just to survive. Now it's even more so when they're trying to lead. And so it took me years to actually be able to get to a point where I could say that I was organizing with my community, the community that is experimenting all this terror from immigration customs enforcement, is able to sit down and think and strategize, what are we going to do and how we're going to do it and who's going to do it and what's going to happen afterwards. And so I think that experience, one of being undocumented myself, but also looking for the space and the resources to be able to do the work, is what really informed how I work and why this work needs to be done.
When IRA passed in 1996, which tightened border controls and made it harder for foreign nationals to get visas, many had to decide to stay put and avoid crossing the border out of fear of not being allowed to return. Undocumented individuals are frequently urged to stay under the radar and avoid drawing attention to themselves. Coming out as undocumented while working as an organizer and activist put Maru on ICE's radar. Under the last Trump administration, her ability to stay in the country came under threat. Maru was served a notice to appear by ICE, the first step in deportation proceedings.
Being undocumented there's always the threat of not being able to stay. You never know at what point the government wants you out. The government wants us in when they want labor, when they want cheap, easy to control labor. And then they want you to be disposable. So you never know when you're disposable to them and they no longer need you. And so you're always under that constant fear. But what happened under the Trump administration is that, me not being the traditional target for this kind of decisions, because I was already known as an undocumented immigrant organizing. I had already met with ICE several times for some years already. It came a bit of a surprise that they decided to put me on deportation proceedings without having any of the traditional, contacts with police or any of that. I wasn't the only one. That obviously there were others like me, that this was a strategy set by the administration and by ICE to get rid of people like me and to scare others into doing the work we were doing. And so obviously it did create an impact in my family, in my personal life. Obviously I am scared like everybody else, but I also get angry. And personally, my anger always takes over fear. And so it just gave me more of an excuse to continue the work than I could ever thought in my entire life before then.
La Resistencia first came together in 2014 to support a hunger strike at the detention center in Tacoma. Over the years, through their work, La Resistencia has not only continued to push for abolishing the mass prison system, but has also been able to bring to the forefront the cycle of abuse perpetuated by the system.
It's a private detention center and wants to make as much money as they can. And they want to increase the number of people that will provide this corporation, Geo Group, that owns and runs the detention center money, right? So I think one of the reasons why it has become also one of the detention centers with the longest stay and lowest possibility of being released is because in 2021, Geo lost a lawsuit because in the Washington state law, regardless of your immigration status, if you work for someone, you have to be paid. And Washington state's minimum wage is the highest in the country. And people were working for Geo since they opened, in 2004 throughout the country. They have this huge excuse that the feds allow them to have people working for them while detained, which is the most ridiculous thing if you think about it. When I started organizing in 2014 with people in detention and on their first hunger strike in March of 2014, that first strike, the top demands included to get paid what it was fair. And I was like, wait, what? You're working while you're detained and you're not getting paid, yet you got detained because you were working without a social security. You don't have the social security and you're still working for the corporation that is detaining you. See how ridiculous this system is, and yet they keep blaming people. immigrants for everything that's happening in the world, everything that is wrong. And these corporations are getting away with this level of exploitation. And so in 2021, this lawsuit was successful. Geo lost, and a federal jury and judge said, you can't do this. If you're going to have people detained, you have to pay them the minimum wage. And by the way, you owe $17 million to everybody that worked from 2014 to 2021.
Geo Group appealed the decision, and just last month, 4 years later, a federal appeals court affirmed the lower court's decision, ruling that individuals detained at the Northwest ICE Processing Center, a private, for-profit facility, must be paid Washington's minimum wage for any work performed. Geo Group previously paid detainees just $1 per day. Following Geo's appeal of the 2017 lawsuit, a federal judge concluded that Geo unjustly enriched itself through use of the work program. The court has ordered the company to pay detained workers the state's minimum wage moving forward, as well as $23.2 million.
Their formula is to make money, based on everything that they can get away with. And so how are they going to make money now without exploiting the people that they're detaining, incarcerating? Is, we're going to keep them as long as possible to make more money. And that's why it's so urgent to shut down the place, because this retaliation is just going to keep growing.
Hunger strikes are a nonviolent protest tactic in which individuals refuse food for an extended period to press for specific demands. Throughout history, hunger strikes have been used by various movements, from struggles for independence to labor rights advocacy. For marginalized communities, particularly those in detention, hunger strikes serve as a powerful means to demand improved conditions, policy reforms, or accountability for human rights abuses. Prolonged hunger strikes become a means to express resistance through the use of their bodies. Unfortunately, it is also not uncommon for authorities to respond with retaliation. The University of Washington Center for Human Rights discovered that ICE frequently employs solitary confinement as a form of retaliation and punishment. At the Northwest Detention Center, solitary confinement is used more extensively than at any other immigration detention facility in the United States.
Hunger strikes are the most powerful organizing tool that an incarcerated person has. And so we don't like people going on hunger strike. Every time we heard a hunger strike started or is coming, we're all like, oh man, no, it's worrisome. It's very worrisome, because someone deciding not to eat and provide their body the basic nourishment needed, it's already, putting yourself at that risk. It's a huge sacrifice that no one should do. But at the same time, under those conditions, not only being a horrible place in regards to conditions, but the level of retaliation. And so having that kind of organizing shows the level of desperation that people have, yet they're able to still organize. They're able to come together and show that in the worst of circumstances, you can still and you have to organize, right? You have to organize. So those hunger strikes are like the moral compass that Resistencia uses for the organizing outside.
Hunger strikes have become common at the detention center. In 2024, individuals detained at Northwest staged 14 documented hunger strikes. The power of grassroots organizations such as La Resistencia is their effort to support the agenda set by those most impacted. This sets a powerful precedent for activism, perhaps a model that we should all aspire for in our efforts, centering the voices of those most impacted as opposed to the voices of those who hold more power, defending the interests of the most vulnerable among us.
But the U.S. doesn't really have an organizing tradition, an organizing from the base. The organizing has been led mainly from nonprofits. And nonprofits are still part of the capitalistic environment, both political, economical, and social in the U.S. And so the idea of true organizing from the base it doesn't quite exist. You have to come up with it. Because in order for you to be able to do this work, you have to have the time, you have to have the tools, you have to speak the language. And if you are to receive any donation, you have to be a nonprofit, or you have to be under, the fiscal sponsorship of a nonprofit. So all of that makes it extremely, extremely difficult. Organizing is just one part within the larger environment to change the system. People think that there's policy and there's advocacy and there's organizing, and that's not the reality. In order to change things, like change systems and make those changes long term, you need to work from outside what it already exists. Otherwise, you're just repeating things. And a lot of nonprofits, a lot of groups in the immigrant rights movement, they use the same tools all the time that haven't worked. They continue asking the feds for a bill. And then they ask for, let's pardon this community and give them, a pardon so many years that you're not going to deport them, and give them annual work permits that they have to renew. Maybe that worked in the past, but it's not working anymore. And that's the comfortable position that most big nonprofits have taken, because they also rely on personal relationships with some of those people in power. And so if you're thinking of your group as having to prioritize relationships with people in power, you're not prioritizing the people that should be making the decisions. So there's so many things that I think makes it very difficult to actually achieve that, to really allow people that should lead the fight to be able to lead the fight. We should be working, all of us, to create that space for them, to give them those resources, and us just follow what they need and provide what they are requiring from us, instead of us telling them what to do and when to speak, and just bring your story and tell your story. Because I've heard that so many times. Oh, can you just share their story? No, we are not here to take up a space. We're here to build the space. And that's been a challenge. And Trump taking office is already bad. It's getting worse. And I don't see that space being built by the traditional nonprofits and those that have the power and have the tools and have the privileges that are needed to move the space for those that are the real experts.
The danger of using stories in any space that focuses on social impact is the tokenization of narratives, reducing detained individuals to voiceless anecdotes rather than leaders within their fight for justice. This dynamic feeds into a saviorist power dynamic. Without those impacted leading the movement, storytelling risks becoming exploitative, stripping detained individuals of agency while allowing external actors to control the narrative and dictate solutions. Entering the second Trump administration, we must ask ourselves, what can we do differently?
I still think that most of the movement are thinking of the same ways to react or to solve the issue. And I think that's the problem. I think that most groups that have much more privileges, much more resources, much more space, much more connections, are not really doing what they're supposed to do, which was to build the space for the small groups on the ground to take the lead and to tell us how we should go about it and where should we go. And because that wasn't done, that's where I'm so worried right now. I know local groups will do their thing. Local groups always do their thing. They always survive. They always fight back. There's a reason why the community goes to the small groups. You don't see communities showing up to the door of, big nonprofits. They go to their personal relationships, which are these groups. And these groups always find a way to survive and make it happen, some levels of protections for their own communities. But there's this big disconnect, again, between the big nonprofits and to what their role is really to support the local work. And that's when I think the mitigation will happen at very small levels, and we possibly are not going to be able to witness a lot of that because it's going to be such a tiny scale. And we could have mitigated at a larger level if big groups with a lot of resources would finally change how they see their role in the movement if they were to support those groups, those tiny groups, those small groups on the ground.
Immigrant detention intersects with other issues such as racial inequality, labor rights, and environmental justice. Northwest Detention Center is located in the heavily polluted Tacoma Tide Flats, an area deemed unfit for living. The facility sits next to a federal Superfund cleanup site where toxic sludge from a former coal mine and gasification plant contaminated the soil for decades. 2 massive piles of toxic waste occupy the area. The detention center operates in an industrial zone where forever chemicals persist in the environment. This is a case of environmental racism.
When a disaster happens, the first ones to die, the first ones to receive the impact are poor people, people of color. And if you also think about those that are detained, happen to be the majority being Black and brown. And I always share this example because I think it's very, very clear of that level of racism, how racialized the immigration system is. Some years ago, over 60 Cubans that moved together to Mexico and then crossed the border together into the U.S. and they surrendered themselves at the port of entry, and they were taken into detention together. They were requesting asylum. And so they went on hunger strike because they were supposed to be released within 180 days of detention, and that didn't happen. And, those 180 days turned 190 and 200 and something, and finally they decided to go on hunger strike. We made it public, and finally we start seeing some of them getting released. We only talked to them over the phone at that time. We didn't have video calls, so we couldn't see them. And so anybody that calls us, we don't make assumptions about anyone. We ask certain details just to, be able to be in touch with them and kind of figure out what can we do to support them and their cases in order to be released. But we don't take on cases. We don't do legal work, none of those things. And so when people are getting released and we were outside waiting for them, I thought, oh gosh, I am such a racist. I thought they were Black and they were light skinned. But as more got released, I think that releases took over 2 weeks, maybe a little bit more. Towards the end, that's when we start seeing Black Cubans being released. And they all had the same premise, that they should have been released together. So that's why we always share that example, because that is the level of racism that you can see being played within detention and even making the decisions of who gets released first, regardless of having very, very similar cases.
The system is unfair and complex to navigate by design. It can feel overwhelming to know how to best support the work being done on the grounds. I asked Maru to share what others can do to support La Resistencia and similar groups doing substantive grassroots work.
I think that what allies can do is to locate the small groups in their areas and never go and say, hey, have you tried this? Have you talked to so-and-so? No, that's a big no-no, okay? What real, true allies need to do is to go and say, what can I do? These are my skills. Can you use them? And tell me how. Offer help, but not to save anyone from anything, but to actually become a follower. To say, I am here to follow your lead. You tell me if I'm helpful, what kind of help can I provide? What kind of support can I provide? And for groups that, might be a little bit more on the, we actually have done this before, we have more experience, become true collaborators. It's the same way. It's just to follow the leadership of the organizations, to follow the leadership of community leaders, and to provide expertise and resources that the groups don't have. But really, this is going to be a very interesting time because the risks are higher for everybody. We also know that the U.S. government is already coming after activists, coming after nonprofits themselves. So the risks are just getting bigger and bigger, higher and higher, and people will need to figure out how willing are they to do certain things, what kind of risks they're willing to take, and what kind of sacrifices are they willing to do. Because movement work is sacrifice, whether we like it or not. Because I've always said it, there's no way we can say, yes, we want to change things. Oh, but wait, I don't want to lose my comfortable status. That's not how it works. And so if people are willing to take a look at their own privilege, to sacrifice, to face risk at whatever capacity and level they can, that's great. But if they really, really want to be part of this, they have to think about that. I actually want to add what Rufina Reyes, the current director of La Resistencia, said after the results of the election last year. She said, we're not going to be afraid because we stopped being afraid and we're not going to go back to be afraid like we were before. So I think we need to follow those examples of people that are willing to fight, willing to risk, and that got tired of being afraid.
Grassroots organizations such as La Resistencia play a crucial role in holding systems of power accountable and advancing advocacy efforts for immigrant rights. Unlike larger institutionalized organizations, grassroots movements are deeply embedded in affected communities, allowing them to support and respond swiftly to injustices and amplify the voices of those directly impacted. Partners such as Global Rights Advocacy work hand in hand to further the mission of grassroots campaigns.
My name is Alejandra Gonza. I am the director of Global Rights Advocacy, a nonprofit based in Seattle with a mission to provide free human rights defense for those who cannot afford a human rights lawyer.
In addition to providing international human rights defense, Global Rights Advocacy has been doing incredible work in documenting the testimonies of detainees at Northwest Detention Center for the past 10 years.
We do the documentarian work with the privilege of talking in a confidential manner inside the detention center during our legal visits. And that's important to know because I do think others like La Resistencia have been talking and documenting detention conditions with their calls for a long, long time. But the differences with Global Rights Advocacy is that thanks to that connection and the trust of La Resistencia in our work, we are able to, with all of those who call La Resistencia and seek help, the ones that really would like to talk deeper into their own situation inside the detention center and are interested in finding out more about what is an international human rights complaint. So if they want to do that is when we go in and we can do what we call a human rights intake, where we take a deeper look at the situation of the person. We talk a little bit about what they were doing before, the families, their immigration case, but we focus mainly on their experience at the detention center. It's also a trust-building work. We introduce ourselves. We introduce the collaborative nature of the work that we do. We seek their consent to do the work. And also how that could impact others and how we can connect whenever we can. Sometimes we can't. There's no other way of helping people out, but connect with other organizations or bringing those voices to other authorities that could and should do something about the individual situation that we are reporting. That is the privilege that we have. And the difficulties are a lot. I do think more and more that, the rhetoric of hate against immigrants will impact how they treat us as immigrants when we go in, but also how they are treating people inside. And so I do think those challenges will be there both for the people inside, for immigrants defenders outside. And we should be very vigilant of that. And that's why I do think it's extremely important to continue doing that work and continue in bringing in those legal visits the eyes of different lawyers and perspectives that could document and build the story of the place from within.
Having spent much of my career working on ethical storytelling practices, when I began working with global rights advocacy, I was confronted by the very real challenges of balancing storytelling for social change while being cognizant of the way storytelling for impact can sometimes flatten or tokenize communal experiences. Which is why GRA's documentarian work and how that translates into the Melting Ice Project really piqued my interest. The project is a collaboration between La Resistencia, Global Rights Advocacy, and UW-Tacoma that artfully humanizes a problem that often dehumanizes individual narratives, allowing the people most impacted to guide the storytelling process.
It's a project that is really telling the story of a strong decade of fight by undocumented leaders and representing themselves, the voices of people in detention. And I love the project because by documenting the advocacy La Resistencia has done for so many years, it also brings to the core of the idea of the people affected by detention being the ones designing what reparations means for them. It is a creative way of using our intakes and testimony gatherings for legal purposes into one main request that a few years ago people in detention has done to La Resistencia and Global Rights Advocacy, which was please tell our stories. During the pandemic, it was evident that with the closure of the Center for Visitation, more and more, it was difficult to bring those voices out and continuing putting in the public space what they envision as remedies in a very difficult moment in the world. And that's how all of these illustrated testimonies and transforming the idea of legal work into storytelling has been key also to advance those advocacy strategies too. It's not isolated, it's not disconnected with all the amazing work in different areas that La Resistencia does. We are just a little piece of a bigger fight, La Lucha, for so many years, for changing the system. And at the end, to transfer the idea that the shutting down of the detention center is not something that we are telling as lawyers from here on our desks, but that is the understanding that people that suffer the detention center knows that is the only way to go forward. We have an exhibit now telling that story, the story of resistance, the story of each person, and also the system that oppresses immigrants and that is built to dehumanize them. And so putting the stories out is telling the stories of their families, of who they are, their skills they have, the jobs they had, and how those families were broken by these detentions, and that the consequences go beyond the individual case, but it's in our own communities that those families were broken, those communities are broken.
The Melting Ice Project is a visual storytelling project. The exhibition serves as both an artistic and political intervention, while also engaging the practice of storytelling as an act of living resistance to the oppressive conditions of immigration detention. The exhibition features the stories and experiences of immigrants previously and currently detained at Northwest Detention Center. From showcasing the stories of release, to the stories of those who remain in detention, to even the stories of those who have passed away while detained, the project exposes the suffering that often remains unseen: rampant sanitization issues, medical neglect, physical and sexual abuse, family separation, and other forms of systemic violence inflicted upon detained individuals. As an international human rights lawyer for Alejandra, testimonies and storytelling are a powerful tool for legal advocacy.
I think it helped me translate the technical elements of my legal advocacy, that is the use of international human rights law, something that is very unique, not very common in this region of the United States, and how international human rights law could play a role, although limited with all of the challenges that we have, but could play a role into changing the system as we know it.
By centering the voices of those most impacted, GRA's documentarian work is a call to action, a demand for justice, and a reminder that resistance persists, even in the darkest corners of the immigration system. Throughout history, storytelling has had the power to drive meaningful change. A series of photographs by Louis Hine in 1909 documenting child labor in American factories forced policymakers to consider the very real implications of industrialization. Similarly, documentarian projects such as those being facilitated by La Resistencia and GRA have the power to bring to the forefront the issues surrounding the immigration system in the U.S., within the context of not just domestic efforts, but also when advocating within international human rights mechanisms, starting with challenging the symbolic nature of a detention center in of itself.
The existence of the place in itself as a contradiction to the commitments of the United States towards international human rights law. Civil detention should not exist at all. So to operate with the presumption that everybody detained there should be free, it's kind of changing the dynamic of the dialogue that we need to have. So it's not about just let's talk about detention conditions and how we get the detention conditions better, but to have a deep conversation about the place itself and the human rights issues it brings. Is that why are we jailing immigrants in these facilities that are not detention centers? They are cages. And from that, then is where we have other problems, right? The patterns are over the years repeating themselves, but also getting worse, not getting better. One of the elements that we started out building our advocacy strategies is that the root cause of the problems is the jail itself, that there's a delegation of the custody of immigrants in a corporation, and that there's no legal system of accountability in what is going inside. And all the players are there supposedly taking care of our immigrant community that are going through a process of deportation or even could stay in the country in a manner that by itself constitutes, inhumane treatment of immigrants. All of them, that's one thing that it's good the public to know, that the Northwest Detention Center, and if you go around, you will see it's just almost a maximum security jail with a capacity of almost 1,600 immigrants, and that nobody in there is serving a criminal conviction. All of them are there for a violation of immigration law. That's one big theme in our complaints before the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But then you get into how they treat people inside. And we have seen patterns of use of solitary confinement. And let's not forget that recent 2 deaths have happened in all these settings, right? Mr. Daniels died in March 2024 after being in solitary confinement for most of his prolonged detention, 4 years. The recent death of a Mexican immigrant, Mr. Sanchez, happened in the setting of medical isolation, supposedly. Also, according to international law, after 15 years, that's torture. And so we are talking about a place where we are documenting torture. The other elements of detention are of concerns, like the lack of adequate medical care, the lack of proper nutrition, the food that they are given are described constantly over these 10 years that I've been documenting testimonies of people, like food that they would not share with their own dogs. That's kind of a quote of many immigrants from different countries that they say. The recent documentation of suicide attempts, fires in the place without a proper safety protocol.
A report published by the UW Center for Human Rights about detention conditions at Northwest Detention Center uncovered significant concerns regarding the reporting mechanisms for sexual abuse and assault within the facility, effectively calling the calls for help as calls to nowhere, despite what on the surface appears to be a robust system of documentation and reporting.
And at the end, that brings us to the lack of accountability and the lack of resources for people in detention to defend themselves, to have independent assessment of their own situation. The one judging if something happened or not is Geo and ICE inside the detention center with the grievances mechanism.
It comes to no surprise that private detention centers lack meaningful accountability for human rights abuses. Reports of sexual violence, physical abuse, medical neglect, and inhumane living conditions frequently surface, yet mechanisms for redress remain inadequate. Many detainees face significant barriers to reporting violations, including fear of retaliation. Even when complaints are filed, investigations are often slow, lack transparency, or dismissed outright, allowing perpetrators to act with impunity. The absence of independent oversight and meaningful consequences perpetuates a cycle of abuse, leaving detainees vulnerable. This is where international human rights bodies can offer the independent assessment and accountability that the current domestic system lacks.
It plays an important role because it's filling up a vacuum that exists in the system when the system itself, when the laws, the policies, and the practices are built to torture people, to oppress people, to cage immigrants. And there's no way out because what we have been witnessing, pressuring the U.S. government to do something about the immigrants at the Northwest Detention Center, is the lack of legal avenues for them to obtain that. The lack of legal avenues to complain and present lawsuits against ICE or GEO for the mistreatment, for torture, for the punishment. And because of that is where when the domestic law and the domestic system does not respond and does not give reparations and remedies, that's where international human rights law could play the role of bringing international independent assessments into what is going on at the detention center.
A fundamental principle of international human rights law is the requirement to exhaust domestic remedies before seeking intervention from these larger international or regional bodies. This means that individuals or groups who have suffered human rights violations must first attempt to obtain justice through their own country's legal system. This requirement serves multiple purposes. It respects the sovereignty of national legal systems. It encourages states to uphold their human rights obligations. And it also ensures that international mechanisms act as a last resort rather than a substitute for domestic justice.
And although the U.S. government has a weaker connection with international human rights law, is a signature of 3 main human rights treaties. And also, as we've seen recently here, we were able, by using international human rights law, to bring in an independent commission, the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, to the place, to visit the place, and with their independent eyes, take a look at the situation immigrants are in, because we were able to prove under international human rights law that immigrants detained are in danger of suffering irreparable harm. And that's something very challenging to do domestically.
The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an autonomous body of the Organization of American States, OAS, tasked with promoting and protecting human rights throughout the Americas. That's 35 countries, including the United States. However, the United States, surprise, surprise, does not recognize the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which means the U.S. will accept recommendations from the Commission, but that's about it. Established in 1959, the IACHR monitors member states' compliance with human rights obligations and processes individual petitions alleging rights violations. It also conducts country visits, issues reports, and makes recommendations to address structural human rights issues. The Commission's relevant functions include receiving and evaluating complaints of human rights violations and issuing precautionary measures to individuals or groups, with specific recommendations of protections. In 2020, the IACHR issued a precautionary measure in response to concerns over the health and safety of individuals detained at Northwest Detention Center. The Commission recommended adopting measures to protect the right to life and health of detained immigrants after finding the situation was urgent, grave, and that detainees were in danger of suffering irreparable harm.
Being able to have international human rights recommendations from the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights or the United Nations, it's an important tool for us to keep fighting and to engage also with authorities. So one part of the engagement is with the federal government, with ICE, with the Office of Civil Rights, and all the system that is created around detention. But all of that is ICE, the Office of Civil Rights, it's belonging to the agency that we are complaining about. And so that independent assessment is extremely important as a tool. It's not going to change the whole system by itself. It's one element that could help us fight in the way and with the principles of dignity, equality, and the protection of immigrants as our main goal. And I think that is the important part of international human rights law.
Most people are familiar with the United Nations and its role in international human rights, but far fewer are aware that there are also regional human rights systems that operate alongside these global mechanisms. These regional systems, such as the Inter-American, European, and African human rights bodies, play a crucial role in addressing human rights violations within specific geographic areas.
From the very beginning, it was clear that the goal was shutting down the detention center. So that is kind of the north that we are following. And closing the jails and detention center is a reparation that could be suggested and is suggested by international human rights bodies. And that's why we thought, okay, if we want to do that, even though if we can obtain only what is called a recommendation with a non-binding power over the U.S., we have strong independent guidance to the United States. And many times in different settings, in the engagement with international human rights bodies, that's kind of the value that the U.S. government also has given. It could be a guidance. We're going to take this into account. So if the goal of La Resistencia is the shutting down of the detention center, then we go and talk with people in detention, and it's the same. All of them are saying this place should not exist. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is in Washington, D.C., and it has a preventive system of precautionary measures, but it has the potential of receiving complaints on the merits against the United States. We don't have the possibility of reaching the Inter-American Court on Human Rights because the United States did not recognize jurisdiction over the court. So it's what we have. That's an avenue that we use. And it was not only useful because of the recommendations themselves, which is a resolution, which puts you in a contradictory process where your arguments are contradicted by the arguments of the U.S. government. The U.S. government have participated over the last 4 years in the process, and then end up within that precautionary measure with a visit accepted by the U.S. government of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to the center.
Just this past October, the IACHR made a visit to Tacoma and met with individuals arbitrarily detained and their families. The visit provided an opportunity for productive dialogue with detainees, families, grassroots organizers, advocates, educators, lawyers, and political leaders. In follow-up on precautionary measures granted by the Commission, the visit centered around critical concerns regarding solitary confinement, inadequate sanitation, insufficient access to medical care, the use of force by private actors, and death in detention.
In the United Nations, we also had what is called urgent calls. And it's a different system, but it has certain similarities in terms that to have the reaction and the communication, the official communication from the United Nations special procedures to the U.S. government and to Geo company, you have to prove the emergency that people are in. It's very similar in terms of the elements. The main difference and the reason we use also that process is that the United Nations special procedures have the power and the mandate not only to write letters and communicate with the U.S. government, but also sending concerns on the human rights responsibilities of corporations. And in that capacity, it's where we were able to get an independent human rights body to send a letter to the company itself, demanding that the company abides by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which call them to address the situation, prevent, mitigate, and remedy.
Both the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, precautionary measures, and the United Nations special procedures serve as mechanisms to protect individuals or groups facing imminent harm. However, the UN system is better equipped when addressing human rights violations committed by companies because of its broader mandate and mechanisms specifically designed to engage corporate actors. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGPs, established a global framework for corporate responsibility, outlining states' duties to protect human rights, businesses' responsibilities to respect human rights, and the need for effective remedies for victims. These international mechanisms offer a really important avenue for legal advocacy and justice, especially as we reckon with the current political climate. We've been here before.
I do think now we enter this stage with 4 years of experience under Trump administration. And I do think we have to take him by his word. We are going to start with a lot of executive orders that will impact the detention system in itself and make it more powerful and dangerous. And that's why I do think we should continue building the movement and helping people out as much as we can from the position of power that we have. In the past, we were concerned about the surveillance and targeting and detention of immigrant defenders. We should be vigilant of that. And so I do think it's an important moment to strengthen up what you were doing before, because it's going to be needed.
The fight for migrant justice is not just about policy changes. It's about cultural change, respect, and dignity for all people, and resistance of the overwhelmingly forceful and punitive approach to controlling groups of people. The experiences shared today highlight not only the inhumane conditions inside detention centers, but also the powerful organizing that continues despite the systemic obstacles designed to break the will of those detained. Hunger strikes, mutual aid, direct action, international advocacy, these are not just strategies, but lifelines for people navigating a system that thrives on unrestrained neglect and punishment. Migrants in detention are not passive victims. They and their communities are organizing, resisting, and demanding change. And yet, as Maru pointed out, the system is structured to silence them, to deny them resources, and to punish them for daring to speak out. This is why the work of grassroots organizations like La Resistencia is crucial. They amplify the voices of those inside, mobilize advocates, and challenge the policies that uphold these violent institutions. But they cannot do it alone. True solidarity means more than just awareness. It requires action. Support grassroots groups doing the work, donate to mutual aid funds, and use your voice to demand an end to detention as a tool of oppression. As we are recording this, there have already been nationwide protests and labor strikes in response to anti-immigration policy and ICE raids. We will link to resources in the show notes regarding how you can stand in solidarity with these efforts. Fear cannot dictate our actions. The people most affected by these policies, the ones living under constant threat, have already decided that they will not be afraid. It is up to us to follow their lead, to refuse complacency, and keep pushing forward. With that, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This podcast is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Noah Kowalski.